Welcome to April the 20th. Today is the 229th anniversary of France declaring war against the King of Hungary and Bohemia, which, as you know, was the Holy Roman Emperor, Francis II, which is what began the French Revolutionary Wars, sparking the First Republic for France. Now back to more important subjects of study for today. We are starting with Torghast. We have gone through quite a few cycles of this PTR with news and additions to Torghast. We have gotten the first bit regarding the possibility of a score-based system for Torghast, ranks, ladders, and points to be earned when you run inside of Torghast. Then we have gotten another bit regarding the possibility of experience inside of Torghast. Is it experience for your runs? Maybe to unlock different things, some things similar, somewhat similar to the honor system, the rank system for honor, or maybe just for allowing alts and lower characters to actually properly level inside of Torghast. And then now we get a few more bits regarding Torghast. Number one is there's going to be more layers. 4 more layers have been added to each floors. And number two, we're going to get 2 new zones, 2 new wings for Torghast. Now, because there has been some confusion regarding what exactly is the floor of Torghast and what exactly is the layer of Torghast, people seem to have gotten kind of confused about this. This is what you look at, right, when you try to enter Torghast and you have to select a layer. This is what it looks like for kids. Each of the wings is going to have 8 different layers, the ones that range in difficulty, the ones that become harder when you go higher. And then inside each and every one of these layers, you have the 6 floors. Floor 1 and floor 2, floor 3 is the vendor, and then floor 4 and floor 5, and then floor 6 is the vendor with the boss. That's what it looks like. The change Blizzard is adding to Torghast in 9.1 is the fact that now the layers go all the way up to 12. So the floors will remain the same, the way you complete Torghast remains the same. 1 and 2 is clearing the floors, floor 3 is the vendor, then you clear 4 and 5, and then 6 is the vendor and the boss. Now, instead of stopping at layer 8, which is what you're doing now for your Soul Ash, you have to go up to 9, 10, 11, and 12. Once you have done that the first week, from the following week, you can just go back to clearing layer 12. Just like with the release of Shadowlands, you had to go from layer 1 all the way up to layer 8, and then you just sat on layer 8 for months. Despite confusing people, this change is basically just for the increased item level. Because of course, with the new patch, item level is going to increase. You're going to get all the way up to 250, even closer to 260. So Blizzard had 2 options. Either they do it like a Mythic Plus, either they do it like dungeons, where they scale the dungeons up. So they don't make you run Mythic Plus 35, Mythic Plus 50, and then by the end of the expansion you are clearing Mythic Plus 70. They simply scale up the dungeons. For Torghast, they've done the opposite. For Torghast, they simply added more layers, probably because going from 8 to 12 still seems like a reasonably small number. So there was no need to just scale down to shrink the differences in gear between all the different layers of Torghast, particularly if they are planning to use Torghast as it's a possibility for a leveling experience, right? For lower characters to go in. And for this purpose, they also added the recommended item levels for the new layers. So layer 9 is 200 item level, layer 10 is 210, layer 11 is 220, and what do you know, layer 12 is 230 item level. To put this in perspective for 9.1, layer 12 and 230 is going to be roughly what you get in the normal raid difficulty of the next tier. If you're still confused, then let's put this into Mythic Plus terms. That is the equivalent of completing a Mythic Plus 7, 230 item level in 9.1. So that is the range of item level required for clearing the last of the layers for Torghast. Now, back to the original point though, which is the fact that Torghast is not going to be as important as 9.0, as this current version of the game. We have covered this already. 9.1 will not require Soul Ash for upgrading your legendaries. You will upgrade your legendary to rank 5 and to rank 6 to 250 and 260 item level without Soul Ash, at least what we have so far. Blizzard is adding an entirely new recipe, pattern and crafting system that will not have anything to do with Soul Ash, which means inside Torghast you will not have to be in. I don't know why I just spoke like Yoda, but that's how it is. You only go inside Torghast for, I don't know, you like the new score system, if the score system is cool, you go inside Torghast because of the mounts and the pets and I'm assuming the toys they're going to add inside of Torghast, if you still want to keep up some of your soul ash to craft some additional legendaries. After all, we never know which legendaries Blizzard is going to buff and nerf and create new ones as well, so you still need some sort of, you know, safety net, backup soul ash to instacraft a rank 4 legendary whenever you need to. But it is not something, like, to be clear, it is not something, at least so far, from what we know, it is not something you need to do every week. Unlike, for example, Renown, which is just very simply going from rank 1 to rank 40 in 9.0 to rank 41 to rank 80 in 9.1, which is something you will want to clear every week, Soul Ash and Torghast does not seem to be the same way. Now, as for the two new wings, well, that's pretty expected. We have gotten this already in something like Island Expeditions in BFA. We have gotten this even all the way back when we had scenarios in Mist of Pandaria. They just get added patch by patch. What we know so far is just the names, Adamant Vaults and Forgotten Catacombs. So we don't have, because Torghast is still closed in the PTR, we don't have any new info on assets, models, you know, the theme of the entire zone. Of course, we can guess. We can take a guess from the name alone, Forgotten Catacombs. I'm going to take a wild guess and assume it's not going to be a wild, green, lushy plains with trees and flower mobs. But for now, we have to wait until the moment they actually open up Torghast and we can see what's inside. Now, the other point of today, the other point of April the 20th, even though this is Revolutionary Day, we have something not very revolutionary. In fact, what we have instead, no revolution, just a very strict adherence to the norm. The norm is to nerf Sanguine Depths. This is something that has been going on for a few weeks. We could say even a few months from the first time this happened. All the way since when Necrotic Wake and Sanguine Depths were sparking terrors in players' eyes, Blizzard rolled up their sleeves and started beating with a nailed bat Necrotic Wake to the knees, and Sanguine Depths sort of took a little bit longer to be put back in line, but this round of nerfs is another one that's gonna happen on the weekly reset, so tomorrow, or I guess today, if you are unfortunate and live in NA, there is really just a couple of major changes for Sanguine Depths, but are really, really big. So, the least important ones. Dark Acolyte's Dark Bolt cast time is increased from 1.5 seconds to 2. Dark Bolt is pretty annoying. It's one of those deceptively dangerous casts, because all the way up to +10, +12, +14, +16, you just ignore this. You just focus your interrupt on the really dangerous casts, and this is just something that slips by your interrupts because it doesn't really do much. But then when you start getting into +17, 18, 19, 20, this type of cast, which gets spam cast by the Acolyte without getting interrupted, it starts to become a real problem for the damage intake of your party. So getting a longer cast time is going to be good for your damage intake, both because it's going to be easier to interrupt and also because it's going to happen less often, since it's going to take longer for it to cast. The other change, which is also less important, is the Chamber Sentinel's Craggy Fracture. You know, the fracture, the big swirly circle on the ground, which is going to do a ton of damage and you have to move out of. Now, the damage has been reduced by 20%, it is going to cast less frequently and now targets fewer players. I am not quite sure about the danger of this ability in the entire dungeon. There is, of course, the Chamber Sentinel, the one you pick up with the rest of the pack in the Gauntlet, which is a dangerous one because you're not fighting just the guy. But the majority of the other Sentinels, they were alone, isolated, and this change seems excessive. Of course, for certain groups and for the higher keys, you're gonna pull this one together with other groups. So it was always a grouped up type of fight with this mob in it, but it seems like a pretty major change, especially the damage reduction by 20%. I think it's okay to make it cast less frequently, and it's also okay to make it target fewer players. You know, 3 players is okay. What I don't like is the damage reduction. This is a very large, very slow ability, which is pretty much the only dangerous thing this mob is going to do to anyone that is not a tank. So there should really be no excuse for being hit by this. Reducing the damage is just going to make your embarrassment feel slightly bit less because you're not dying, but it's still embarrassing to get hit by this ability. So I don't think there was too much of a need to reduce the damage as well. Then you have a couple of bug fixes which are actually pretty important, because this used to happen more often than not. Most of the time you read about a bug fix, you read about fixing an issue, which is something you've never heard of, like who even had problems with this, I never even seen this. These ones were more annoying, Grand Proctor Berelia has gotten the issue which caused Endless Torment to double cast, essentially, to multicast in a row. And more importantly, Davos has gotten the issue where throwing a spear at Davos would fail to register a hit when it looked like it should. This is way more important because the negatives, the deficit of missing a spear during that rotation basically is pretty hurtful. So we have to see exactly how it is gotten fixed, but I'm hoping it's fixed properly because I've seen groups failing before. Of course it wasn't me, I would never fail that, but I've seen it happen. Now, leaving the bigger changes for last for Sanguine Depths. The two major pain points of Torghast, if you had to pinpoint them, would probably be the bosses and the Gauntlet. Which is funny because the bosses and the Gauntlet make up for like 50% of the entire dungeon, so that's a pretty large pain point. The first change is for the Gauntlet. Zarali's Shining Radiance now removes all bleed effects, including Severing Strike and Grievous, the affix. This is major. First of all, it makes Grievous much easier, also because the Gauntlet itself can be very nasty for healers and for mana, and pretty much the worst of the affixes for the healer's mana is Grievous, so having the Gauntlet drain your mana plus Grievous drain it even more was very annoying. Now you have the guarantee clear every time you use the Shining Radiance when Kaal is doing her Gloom Squall AoE that you want to dampen with a barrier. Now, on a less important note, Severing Slice can also be removed by the shield. Severing Slice is simply not very relevant due to the fact that it's being cast by the Chamber Sentinel, by the gargoyle. And it's basically the cone bleed ability that usually always hits the tank, but not anyone else if you're careful. So yes, you can remove this with the shield now, removing the bleeds, but this is not the main issue of the Gauntlet. The main issue of the Gauntlet is Wicked Gash. It's the bleed left behind by Kaal. Now, in these changes, in these fixes, there is no mention of Wicked Gash being removed, despite the fact that Wicked Gash itself is a bleed. Maybe Blizzard simply haven't mentioned it. If it did, then it's gonna be major, because Wicked Gash is what's gonna spread around, is what the boss is going to cast and then just hit multiple targets, multiple people. When you're clumped all together, it's difficult to see, to maneuver around that little narrow corridor, and very often the boss is just gonna do his Wicked Gash and then just start ramping up the bleeds on the rest of the party. The real change, the real big change at the end, we left it at the end, is going to be the Wicked Gash itself. Wicked Gash is getting its damage reduced by 33%. This is just the ability of the boss. And it just so happens that this boss, Kaal, is also active during the Thrash. So, nerfing it by 33%, it's not only going to affect the boss fight of Kaal, it is going to affect the Thrash as well. Which is also why I found it interesting that the changes to the bleed removal of Shining Radiance do not mention Wicked Gash, because as you can see, most of the time for the entirety of the Gauntlet, the biggest threat to the party outside of the tank has got other problems during that, but for the rest of the party, the biggest threat is Wicked Gash, the biggest source of damage. And it's not that it's gonna change when it comes to the actual boss encounter. Now, again, when you look at the damage done by Kaal in this fight, of course, it doesn't matter if it's a fortified week or a tyrannical week. The damage stays the same. It increases at the same values. Wicked Gash is essentially the highest damage source, together with the melee auto attack done to the tank. There is pretty much no other damage, provided you don't get hit by the beams, and provided you stand inside Gloom Squall and you don't get knocked off. The only damage you're going to be taking from Kaal as a non-tank is going to be from continuous throws of Wicked Gashes to the entire party, which eventually can also stack on top of itself. It can become more brutal. It's basically the same version of Ventunax in Spies of Ascension, when it teleports behind the player and leaves behind the dot, which hurts a lot. The difference is that Wicked Gash hits multiple players. The difference is that the fight, Kaal, lasts longer, significantly longer than Ventunax. So this dot ends up being more problematic in the end. Getting it nerfed by 33% is pretty significant. What we have to point out though is that just the periodic damage. Wicked Gash also has a pretty heavy instant hit that is done to the target. At plus 20 fortified, the base damage before you apply any damage reduction from versatility, from your own passives, your own defensives, shields, armor, it does 29,000 damage. On squishy targets, without much armor, squishy targets without a defensive active, that's gonna hit you for like 20,000. So yes, Wicked Gash is the most damaging ability in this fight by a landslide when you are not a tank, but a decent part of it, almost 40% of the damage, is going to be the instant part, which isn't getting nerfed by this change. So this is only related to the dot left behind. Obviously, of course, it's much easier to reduce the damage of the instant hit. You have an arrow on your head, you have a few seconds to understand you're about to be hit. You can use a defensive, you can use an immunity, you can use fleshcraft, you can use anything to reduce the damage as much as possible, and then the leftover damage, the dot damage, is the part that gets nerfed. Either way, it's a pretty good change to Sanguine Depths. It is definitely making the Gauntlet more manageable, and the last boss, which was one of the bosses that was sort of left unnerved more so than the rest. You know, Tarvold, the second boss, was nerfed more, way more. Even the first one, Crixus, was also nerfed way more than the last boss, than Kaal. Now Kaal also gets its own fair share of nerfs. So I think it was a pretty positive change. Of course, you know, some people are always happy when something gets nerfed because it is made easier. But I don't want to play content just because it's made easier. I want it to be fair, right? Not just easy, simply more fair. And some of the things in there weren't so fair, particularly the Gauntlet, and particularly because I probably heal the Gauntlet, so I am more personally touched by the frustrations of that part of the dungeon. But for now, this is all we have for today. These couple of changes. I'm pretty interested, honestly, in the changes coming into Torghast. Even though they don't really touch me whatsoever, since there doesn't seem to be player power inside Torghast, I generally don't meddle with those sort of extracurricular activities, like pet battles or reputation farming for factions that don't give you anything worthwhile taking. But it seems like Blizzard has a plan, an interesting plan for Torghast. I want to see where it heads. For now, we will have to wait though, until it's open, and we get to see what's the plan. Thank you for watching the video. If you're still here, you're among the few ones who made it this far. The reward for you should be to subscribe to this channel. If you don't want to subscribe, then at least set up a tier 3 sub to my OnlyFans as an alternative. See you guys soon, very likely tomorrow. And in the meantime, which is the next dungeon that is going to be nerfed? My money is on Theater of Pain.